Hi everyone, this is For the Love of Comics and I'd like to start this video with a small prediction. In just about a minute, I will name my pick for day 7 of 31 Days of Comics. Now that's not the prediction. 31 Days of Comics is just the game that we're playing on this channel, in which me in the video and you in the comments list one and only one pick for each day's category or prompt. Each of the 31 days will have its own video and you can find all previous episodes in this playlist linked up here and in the description below. Today's prompt asks for your comfort comic. And my prediction is this: when I name my pick, most, if not all of you familiar with this comic will have the reaction, yeah, makes perfect sense. That's because my pick is Calvin and Hobbs, written and drawn by Bill Watterson in daily and Sunday newspaper strips for about a decade. In previous episodes of 31 Days of Comics, I've usually talked at length about the category and the process of selecting a comic for it before I revealed my pick. But the reason I'm doing it a little backwards is because I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how Calvin and Hobbs satisfies almost any requirement I may personally have of comfort reading. I identified 5 things that bring me comfort in reading. The first 2 I think would be very common: familiarity and nostalgia. The next 2, a little D&D themed, are intelligence and wisdom. And the 5th one was actually given to me by my wife, who said, I take comfort in something I can trust, or someone as an author that I can trust, which made complete sense to me. And so I put trust as the 5th thing that brings me comfort when I read. And no matter which one or ones of these 5 things I applied, I found Calvin and Hobbs to satisfy it. First, familiarity. It's a newspaper comic strip, giving it a familiar format and a legacy of strips before and after it to compare it to, but also to give it a certain kind of context. Why is it 3 panels? Why is it 4 panels? The kind of gag structure a newspaper comic has. Those of us who grew up reading it in newspapers or these collected volumes, which have been incredibly successful, no matter which way we read it, it's a very popular series that was part of our childhoods or our lives, which connects it to nostalgia. I definitely have distinct memories of reading this comic throughout my childhood and into my adulthood, repeating the same strips over again, but getting different kinds of meaning, or finally getting the joke and the punchline. Having that experience with the familiar sort of set itself over time into nostalgic comfort. But Calvin and Hobbs is also an incredibly nostalgic strip in itself, being primarily about childhood. I don't have to have shared the specifics of Calvin's childhood, but the nostalgia that it creates for childhood, for your favorite toy, for the endless summer, the tyranny of school, the injustice of parental rule, all of these things are things whose rawness sort of recedes over time and they're left with a sort of rosy tinted view of things. It is that nostalgia for childhood, whether one thinks about it as a time of innocence or as a time of imprisonment or as a time of no responsibilities. It is that universal nostalgia that Calvin and Hobbs traffics in. But familiarity and nostalgia can often be quite bland and quite simple, a sort of anodyne, numbing sensation. This is where Calvin and Hobbes's intelligence and wisdom really bring me personal comfort. That here is something that, although steeped in familiarity, although steeped in nostalgia, has the brilliance and the intelligence that it does at its core. The characters of Calvin and Hobbes are always first and foremost the interpretation of our reality by an imaginative and hyperactive kid is so magnificently portrayed as alternate dimensions or parallel realities that for all its simplicity, it remains unsurpassed. The intelligence of the strip is also a very generous one. Calvin often plays the role of a court jester seeing through the sham of the adult world, but equally he represents a sort of unfettered id. Chaos would reign if Calvin was in charge, but the truth-seeing nature of the strip never becomes barbed or caustic because of its wisdom. By wisdom here, I think I'm referring to what people think of as emotional maturity. This strip, in spite of its hijinks, in spite of its chaotic and gag-filled nature, remains a gentle, warm hug in the way that it accommodates all of these different ways of looking at things and all of these ways of being into one universe. The fact that this strip about a boy and his stuffed tiger encompasses so much as far as genre is concerned, as far as storytelling is concerned, all within the constraints of this familiar comic strip, is a result of the deep-seated love that it has for humanity, for all of its foibles, for all of its silliness. There's a reason why this strip has the kind of appeal that it does, universal almost, across demographics, across age groups, and that is because of the open-hearted and generous wisdom at the core of this series. And the fifth reason why Calvin and Hobbes gives me comfort is a little odd, because it's not quite about the strip itself, but about the creator. I trust Bill Watterson as an artist. He is a person who symbolizes to me the lack of compromise, the sticking to artistic principles and ethical principles in a way that I can't think of anyone else who has done it in the same way. The artistic control that he flexed on his series, how he fought for it to have the shape and the nature that it does, how he refused any merchandising, probably letting go of millions and millions of dollars with no exaggeration. If you think about Charles Schulz and other franchised, merchandised revenue earners, the fact that he never once allowed for there to be Calvin and Hobbes towels because of his principles. Long before the mental health break became something that people talked about, he stepped away from syndication in order to spend time with his family. And at the peak of its popularity, after only a decade of being in newspapers, he retired his series because he had done all he wanted to do and he wanted to go out on top and he didn't want it to decay into irrelevance. All of these things are things we say we admire and we appreciate, but we find very few people who actually live up to their principles in the way that Bill Watterson has done. Now, him and his behavior outside of this comic shouldn't make a difference to me, but I think that connection is inescapable. You feel that integrity, you feel that honesty in almost every strip of this series. And I have to say, when thinking about intelligence, when thinking about wisdom, I'm extremely comforted by the fact that Calvin and Hobbes was so successful and continues to be so successful. I'm very comforted by the fact that something so artistic, something so intelligent, something so kind has made so much money, and that was enough for the creator. They could have made 10 times more money, but even that was enough. To me, the fact that something so artistic can be so commercially successful, can be so viable, and could have such a legacy is maybe one of the more comforting thoughts. So those are all the reasons why Calvin and Hobbes is my pick for my comfort comic. Now it's your turn, so in the comments below, let me know what brings you comfort in reading when you seek that out and what your pick is for day 7. Thank you so much for watching. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video.